Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. I hope you guys had a wonderful Thanksgiving. And today, I'd like to focus on a few key battles that the United States participated in during World War I to basically help turn the tide of the war into favor for the Allies. Now, as you'll recall last time, we discussed the reasons why the United States became involved in World War I. And for the first reason they came involved, because we had invested a lot of money and product into helping the Allies win by not only loaning them money, but also producing guns and artillery and all that stuff to help the war effort. Secondly, Germany was conducting unrestricted submarine warfare against any Allied naval ships in the Atlantic, which, as the time they were doing that, they accidentally sunk a bunch of American ships, which really didn't settle well with the U.S. government at the time. But what really pushed us into battle against Germany was something called the Zimmermann telegram, which basically outlined a proposal to Mexico from Germany in that if Mexico were to go join the Central Powers and fight against the Allies in the U.S., that Germany would promise them Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and even California from the United States if they won the war in the end. Which, between all those factors, that really didn't settle well with the U.S. government, which basically caused us to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. Now, even though the U.S. declared war on Germany in 1917, we really did not participate in the First World War for very long compared to our allies of France and Britain and Russia and all those guys over there. We basically were the new army and new kids on the block, but we're ultimately there to help the Allies win in the end. And even though America was a minor army, basically a minor strength in the World War, and for the first year we were trained under the French and British units that had been fighting for nearly 4 years. We'd participate in a bunch of small battles as well as some significant battles that would ultimately help us turn the tide of the war. And that's what I want to focus on today, is a few key battles that the U.S. participated in to help the Allies win World War I. And our first significant battle that the U.S. participated in was the Battle of Cantigny, which took place on May 28, 1918. This is considered to be one of the first major offenses for the Americans in the war, because up until that point in time, American forces were spread out among French and British units, basically as a training tool to help the Americans get acquainted with trench warfare and all that good stuff. The battle started at 4:45 a.m. whenever artillery bombarded German units that were holding the town at that point, and basically softened up the town with mustard gas and mortar shells and all that fun stuff. A couple hours later, after the bombardment had died down, American and French tanks came into the town to basically mop up the survivors, along with 3 waves of American troops to encounter any resistance that was left. It was basically a clear-cut win for the Allies. In fact, they had just taken over the whole town in just a few short hours. This was a very important battle to the American expeditionary forces because this proved that not only Americans could perform effectively on the battlefield, and also opened the eyes of the French and the British in that they knew that now that they could really rely on Americans to perform in battle and to do what they say. And it also helped them to give the Americans more leads into battle and give them more responsibilities to help them win the war in the end. Now, this victory would be short-lived for just a few short days before the Battle of Belleau would start for the Allies. Which brings me to my second battle that the U.S. greatly participated in, the Battle of Belleau Wood, that happened from June 1st to June 26, 1918. Now, Belleau Wood is located about 50 miles northeast of Paris, and it was a heavily fortified area for the Germans that had held it for so many years. And the combatants that took place in that battle were 5 German units against the U.S. Army's 2nd Division, which consisted of units of regular Army infantry soldiers as well as different Marine units underneath the division, which included the 4th Marine, the Brigade, the 5th Marine Regiment, as well as the 6th Marine Regiment. Now, the Marines, along with these units, included 3 rifle battalions, which basically included 800 men, and each one included a machine gun company that would help out each regiment. And the 2nd Division also included 2nd Field Artillery Brigade of the U.S. Army and other units of the 2nd Regiment of Engineers. Now, Belleau Wood, the place where the battle took place, basically stretched about a mile wide from north to south and about anywhere from a quarter to half a mile wide east to west, which all that wooded area was it was full of nothing but embedded German soldiers willing to do anything to defend that territory, along with another German offensive that was set up on a hill called Hill 142, just to the west of that forest, to basically counter any other resistance that would come from all sides of the forest. Now, the actual attack began on June 6, 1918, and was led by Marines of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment. And their first tactic was to take out the Germans overlooking the forest on Hill 142, which the Marines had no problem taking over the hill. In fact, it was a pretty easy victory for the Marines to really start off the battle. Now, once Hill 142 was taken, this allowed for Marines and other soldiers to pour artillery fire and basically soften the ground for any embedded German units that were in the trenches in the forest area, which was ultimately designed to make it easier for Marines to advance into the forest and to take over embedded trench lines. Once the barrage ended, this prompted the immediate attack of Marine forces into the forest, which it went pretty well for the Marines for a while. That is, until they did encounter some German resistance at one point or another. In fact, whenever the Marines of the 5th Regiment tried to take over the one side of the forest, German machine gun and artillery fire basically killed almost everyone in the 5th Marine Regiment. It was all torn to shreds. And while the 5th Marine Regiment was encountering heavy fighting from that side, the 6th Marine Regiment fought on the southern edge of the forest before they advanced into the forest, where they also encountered a bunch of enemy machine gun fire. So even though they had had some success until that point in the battle, they were surrounded by German soldiers so much that they had to end up digging trenches in order to seek refuge from all the advancing German soldiers. That was when 100 soldiers from the 2nd Regiment of Engineers came to reinforce the nearly 200 Marines that were trapped in these trenches. Now with that, when reinforcements arrived for them, they were able to counter a bunch of German attacks for nearly a solid week before other reinforcements came in. And while that's going on, the 5 other Marine units were able to take most of the forested area away from the Germans. In fact, a lot of the forest was taken by June 11th, 1918. And even though that they had taken most of the forest by that point, for the next 2 weeks, the Marines encountered a bunch of hand-to-hand combat with Germans, with rifle butt stocks, bayonets, knives, basically anything that either side could get their hands on to go fight the enemy, which this continued for 2 grueling weeks until the Germans finally gave up. So it was declared a victory for the U.S. Marine Corps on June 26, 1918, whenever a report came out that, Belleau Wood has totally been taken over by the Marines and it's under Allied controls. Now, due to this ferocious fighting and everything, the French government renamed the Belleau Wood the Bois de la Brigade de Marine in honor of all the Marines who made sacrifices to keep that force from being taken over by the Germans. In fact, all the members of the 4th Marine Brigade were rewarded the French Cross de Guerre, basically the French War Medal, for their efforts in the war effort. And success here not only gave more optimism to the Allies, but it also led to a bunch of stories being told in the Marine Corps. Belleau Wood earned a place as one of the significant battles in Marine Corps history, along with, Fallujah during Iraq, Khe Sanh during Vietnam, Chosin Reservoir during Korea, and Iwo Jima during World War II, which, even to this day, Belleau Wood is still regarded as one of the most finest examples of Marine Corps valor in history, and also gave the Allies further confidence to help win the war during the First World War. So, with the victory of Belleau Wood on June 26, 1918, they knew that the Germans weren't going to give up whatsoever, and they needed to be prepared for whatever was going to be thrown at them, which for a few short weeks, they were able to relax and recuperate after that long, significant battle. But the Americans would come to call again during the Second Battle of the Marne, which took place from July 15th through August 6, 1918. This battle really was supposed to be one of the last stands for the Germans, at least the significant stands for the Germans altogether. And it was a very significant battle in that over 270,000 American forces and soldiers participated in the battle. Now, this particular battle was important to the Germans as well as the Allies because, the general of Germany, General Ludendorff, thought that a key victory here along the Marne River was critical for German war efforts because basically the Marne River was almost like a direct line down to Paris where the Germans could take over Paris and everything. So in the back of his mind, he believed that if we could crush the Allies here at the Marne, then that would give us a direct line to Paris and eventually taking over all of Europe, basically. Now, the plan made sense to the general, but it was far from a surprise for the Allies because, the French and the British had a bunch of intelligence on the area. And not only did they have significant numbers of their own troops there ready to attack the Germans, but we also had a bunch of American troops coming in trying to reinforce the area, which gave them even more confidence that they could beat the Germans at this point in time. In the back of their mind, General Ludendorff thought the Germans had a slim chance of winning here, but in reality, the war spirit of all of Germany was fading because of the more American troops that were arriving every day to enforce the Allies. Well, hey, what can you say? I guess General Ludendorff was a little cocky or whatever. He's like, hey, we're going to hold this ground. We're going to take it over no matter what the cost. The Allies deployed 34 different units, including 9 American units, against the 52 German units and brigades in the battle altogether. When the battle started on July 15th, 1918, just like any other battle of World War I, there was a huge artillery barrage that was impounded into the German lines and everything. Basically, it was softening the ground for the troops to come in and mop up the survivors. It was actually started out really well for the Allies. I mean, they met very little resistance against the Germans, even though the Germans did make some headway in keeping their stronghold by killing so many Allied soldiers. In fact, the 3rd American Division actually was surrounded by Germans on 3 different sides at one point. But even at those odds and grueling battles, the Allies still held their own, and they fought for days and days. Even though they halted for the first few days, but on July 18th, the Allies actually started a counterattack, and they actually hit the Germans along the 20-mile front between the Aisne and Marne rivers. And basically totally surprised the Germans so much so that they ended up retreating themselves. And this kept on happening. The fighting kept on happening for 3 solid weeks until the last German unit basically retreated on August 6, 1918. Everything started crumbling down from there for Germany, and their last hope for a victory was basically shattered in front of their eyes. Now, even though victory here was clear-cut for the Allies, there's another significant battle a month later that would further instill in the Germans that, hey, this is the end. We need to rethink our game plan here. And that particular battle is the Battle of St Miele, which took place on September 12th and lasted until September 16th, 1918. So, up until this point in time, the Americans never really had a full section of the front to themselves, like where they totally led and planned and executed an attack or whatever. A lot of the planning and execution was done by the French and the British whatsoever, but this battle is significant in that this is the first full-fledged American attack by the American forces. In fact, General John Pershing, who was the Supreme Commander of American forces at the time, gave permission for the first time to form the 1st U.S. Army sector, which basically meant that Americans could totally control a battle from start to finish and execute it all on their own, which is a really big deal for them at this point in time because they've always been overshadowed by French and British forces and all that good stuff. So the first plan for the 1st U.S. Army at this point in time was for General John Pershing to surprised the Germans by attacking the small town of St Miele. St Miele had been controlled by the Germans for all of the war effort, and General John Pershing thought that a general attack here would halt the Germans so much so that they would go on and retreat to Berlin and further crumble their defenses whatsoever. Now, General Pershing wanted to use 3 different American divisions as well as 1 French unit basically to back us up. He basically wanted to use total warfare to annihilate the Germans, not only with French and American infantry soldiers on the ground, but he also wanted to employ tanks and airplanes too to basically decimate the German lines. This battle would be the first time that, Colonel George Patton, the World War II general hero from World War II, and Colonel William Mitchell would coordinate the employment of basically 1,500 airplanes against the German soldiers. Now, even though they had tanks and airplanes to back them up, they still needed a lot of foot soldiers to carry out this assault. The bombardment actually started on September 12, 1918, with a barrage of artillery fire, gas shells, rockets, the whole 9 yards, basically. They unloaded onto this small town. At dawn, after the bombardment stopped, when the whistle blew, all of the soldiers and Marines, they came out of their trenches and basically went out a full-blown assault on the town despite heavy machine gun fire and artillery fire. I mean, they were very brave, and they were so determined to take over this town because, hey, this is the first time that we, as a whole American unit, need to show off to our allies. We can really do this. And they actually did. They really did. Now, initially, American attacks from the west only had small advances. I mean, it really wasn't a quick victory for them to begin with due to the heavy resistance. But hey, that didn't stop Americans from fighting. They kept on going. And in doing so, by that afternoon, American soldiers were encouraged because they got the news the Germans were retreating. They're like, hey, this is too great of a force. We need to get out of here ASAP. As the Germans were retreating, it made it easier for Americans to advance on the town. And by that evening, they were basically within the boundaries of the town. So on the second day of September 13th, when the Allies, the Americans especially, entered the town from both the southern and western sides, and by that afternoon they had reached their final objective by completely annihilating the last remaining German troops. Now, when they finally took over the town on the 13th, they encountered several counterattacks from the Germans, but hey, they repulsed a lot of those attacks. Those attacks really didn't stand a chance against the Allies whatsoever. And basically, from the 13th to the end of the battle on the 16th, they encountered very little resistance against the Germans. So it was on September 16th that the U.S. First Army basically totally controlled St Miele, and they took 16,000 German prisoners, which was very significant at that time. And it was a clear-cut victory and for us, and it really gave us more confidence as an American unit altogether. And it basically paved the way for the end of the war effort. I mean, Germans basically had no confidence in victory whatsoever at this point in time of the war. Now, there's one last major battle that the United States participated in before the end of the war, and this is perhaps the most significant battle the U.S. participated in throughout the whole war effort, which is the Argonne offensive, which took place from September 26th toward the end of the war on November 11th, 1918. This particular offensive is considered to be the single deadliest campaign in U.S. military history, because it involved more than 1 million American soldiers, and it took the lives of over 26,000 American soldiers. I mean, that's even more than D-Day, the bombing at Pearl Harbor, and all these other significant campaigns. Now, the main purpose of the Argonne offensive was to push the Germans out of the country altogether and to take over train yards that the Germans used to reinforce their army, and to basically reinforce their artillery, guns, all that good stuff. Now, the Argonne offensive, when it launched on September 26, 1918, it actually started in the small French town of Verdun. Of all of the troops that took place in the battle, American infantry forces were supported by 2,700 pieces of artillery, nearly 200 tanks, and over 800 airplanes. And they were all responsible for taking over this 15 to 20 mile wide area between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, which was all controlled by the Germans at that point. And the Allies' mission at that point was to fight northward and break through those heavily fortified network of German defenses, which ran 15 miles deep into the forest. Now, at the beginning of the offensive, the American forces started to gain ground very quickly, very soon in those first few days. In fact, by the end of the month, U.S. troops had pushed 8 miles into the German defenses, roughly halfway through, and took about 9,000 of those soldiers prisoner. But after that, rainy and muddy weather, along with unpredictable terrain, made the battle very unpredictable and uneasy for the Allies to make any advances against the Germans, because it was basically natural camouflage for the Germans. In fact, the force was so thick you couldn't tell who was your enemy or who was your friend or whatever. So October spent a lot of the fighting in the actual forest. The Allies actually suffered a lot of casualties because they didn't know where they were. In fact, there was one particular story about the Lost Battalion, a group of U.S. Army soldiers that at one point was surrounded by German soldiers for 5 days in a row. In fact, artillery was bombarding on top of them and nearly killing everybody there. But despite those odds and those kind of conditions, units like them, they kept on fighting and fighting and fighting. Eventually, they broke the line at the end of October 1918, and they started their advance toward the end of the forested area in November of 1918. And by early November, U.S. forces had reached most of their objective. I mean, they'd taken over the whole Argonne Forest area. Finally, on November 11th, 1918, the Germans were completely withdrawn from the area, which ultimately resulted in the end of World War I, or the Armistice, as it became known after that. So, as you can see, America, even though we participated in the war only about a year and a half or so, we were a very big factor in the result of the Allied victory for us in Europe. I mean, without the Americans being involved like we did, who knows what would have happened during the First World War. We probably would have still won, but Germany would have had a pretty good chance to come back and win everything all over again if we hadn't become involved. So if you like this content, please like and subscribe, and please stay tuned in for the next episode of Captain Patriotic. I appreciate everything, you guys, and please enjoy your holidays and stay tuned in next time. Thank you.